The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of Sunshine Children's Home, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor of the common room. 10-year-old Clara sat at the old piano in the corner, her small fingers hovering above the yellowed keys. She wasn't playing yet, just remembering. 2 years had passed since the night her parents' car never made it home from their anniversary dinner. But the memories still felt fresh as yesterday's rain. "Clara, honey," called Ms. Patel, the kind-eyed house mother who had taken special interest in her since day one. "Would you mind helping me set up for our visitor? He'll be here in 20 minutes. Clara nodded and reluctantly closed the piano lid. The piano had become her closest friend since arriving at the orphanage, the one place where she could pour out all the feelings. Too big for her small body to contain. Is it another one of those rich people who come and take pictures with us and then disappear?" Clara asked, her voice carrying no bitterness, just the straightforward observation of a child who had seen this pattern repeat itself. Ms. Patel sighed, arranging cookies on a plastic tray. "Mr. Bennett is a very important businessman who's made a generous donation to fix our leaky roof. We need to make him feel welcome." Clara helped arrange chairs in a semicircle and dusted the bookshelf without complaint. Inside, though, she felt the familiar knot forming in her stomach. These visits always left the younger children with false hope, believing some wealthy stranger might choose them, take them home to a life of comfort and belonging. At 10, Clara already knew better. Outside, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. Clara watched from the window as a tall man in an expensive suit stepped out, frowning at his phone. Behind him, a woman with clipboard and camera followed like a shadow. "That's him?" Clara whispered. "That's Mr. Richard Bennett," Ms. Patel confirmed, straightening her blouse. "He built a tech company from nothing and sold it for millions last year. Now he runs a foundation that helps places like ours." Clara studied the man as he approached the entrance. His face looked like it had forgotten how to smile naturally. Even from a distance, she could feel the invisible wall surrounding him, the kind adults built when they wanted to keep the messy parts of life at arm's length. "Everyone, gather around," called Mr. Winters, the home's director, as the front door opened. 20 children of various ages formed a ragged line, with the youngest ones in front. Clara stayed near the back, half hidden behind Zach, a lanky 12-year-old who had taken on the role of her protective older brother. Richard Bennett entered the room like he was walking onto a stage, his posture perfect, his expression carefully neutral. His assistant hovered nearby, already snapping photos. "Children, this is Mr. Bennett, whose generous contribution will fix our roof and fund new textbooks for the school year," Mr. Winters announced, his voice carrying the forced cheerfulness adults used when trying to impress other adults. The younger kids clapped as they'd been instructed. The older ones, like Clara, offered polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. "Thank you for having me," Richard said, his voice deep and smooth, clearly accustomed to speaking to crowds much larger than this one. "The Bennett Foundation believes every child deserves a safe place to learn and grow." His words sounded rehearsed to Clara's ears, like lines from a commercial she'd seen too many times. As he continued his brief speech about opportunity and potential, his eyes never quite connected with any of the children standing before him. They seemed to look through them rather than at them. The formal introduction concluded, and the children were encouraged to mingle with their benefactor. The little ones swarmed forward, asking innocent questions about his car and whether he lived in a castle. Richard answered with practiced patience, but Clara noticed how he subtly checked his watch every few minutes. "Would you like to see the music room, Mr. Bennett?" Mr. Winters asked after the obligatory cookies had been served. "We've managed to keep our arts program alive despite budget cuts." Richard nodded, clearly relieved to move on from the children's questions. As the adults headed toward the hallway, Clara slipped away from the group and followed at a distance. The music room was her sanctuary. She felt a strange need to witness how this stranger would react to it. The music room was really just a converted storage space with the old piano, a few worn guitars, and some percussion instruments donated by a local high school. But to Clara, it was the most important room in the building. "We encourage creative expression here," Ms. Patel was explaining as Clara lingered by the doorway. "Many of our children find comfort in music, especially those processing trauma." Richard nodded absently, his eyes sweeping over the humble instruments without interest. His assistant took a few photos of him standing beside the piano, his hand placed carefully on its edge for what Clara recognized as a posed shot. Do any of them actually play? Richard asked, his tone suggesting he doubted it. Oh yes, Ms. Patel brightened. Several show real promise. Clara especially has a natural gift, and is that so? Richard interrupted, his eyebrow raised in what looked like skepticism. Most children just make noise and call it music. Clara felt her cheeks burn. The dismissal in his voice stung worse than she expected. I assure you, Mr. Winters said, some of our students have exceptional abilities. With proper training costs proper money, Richard cut in, and talent without discipline is worthless. An uncomfortable silence fell over the adults. Clara's hands curled into small fists at her sides. Perhaps we should show you the library next, Mr. Winters suggested, clearly eager to change the subject. Richard turned away from the piano with a small shrug. Then, as if suddenly remembering he was being photographed, he added with a tight smile, though I suppose if I heard a child play something truly impressive, I might consider funding music lessons. Who knows? I might even adopt a musical prodigy. He laughed, as if he'd made an amusing joke. His assistant laughed on cue. Mr. Winters managed a weak chuckle. Miss Patel's smile faltered. Clara stepped into the doorway, unable to hold herself back any longer. I can play for you, she said quietly. All heads turned toward her. Clara wished immediately that she could take back the words, dissolve into the shadows of the hallway, but it was too late. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly as they fell on her, this small, serious-faced girl with unruly dark curls and a faded blue dress that was a size too big. For a moment, no one spoke. Clara, Ms. Patel began gently. Mr. Bennett is on a tight schedule. No, let's hear it. Richard interrupted, his mouth curving into what wasn't quite a smile. I did make an offer, didn't I? His tone made it clear he expected little, which somehow made Clara even more determined. She walked to the piano with measured steps, trying to control the trembling in her hands. As she sat on the bench, she had to adjust it higher, a reminder of how small she still was in this big, indifferent world. What will you play for us, young lady? Richard asked, checking his watch again. Something I wrote, Clara answered, her voice steadier than she felt. Richard's eyebrows rose in obvious disbelief. His assistant stopped typing on her phone to watch. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, gathering herself. In her mind, she could see her mother's hands guiding hers over these same keys in their old apartment, before everything changed. She could hear her father's encouraging voice telling her that music was the language of feelings, too deep for words. She began to play a simple melody, the first notes of a piece she'd been composing bit by bit over the past year. It started soft and hesitant, like the first raindrops before a storm, carrying with it a question without words. Richard crossed his arms, his expression making it clear he was merely humoring this child. Behind him, Ms. Patel watched Clara with quiet pride, while Mr. Winters looked nervously between the wealthy donor and the orphaned girl. None of them knew what was coming next, that this encounter would change the course of lives in ways no one could predict. Not the cynical millionaire who made promises he never intended to keep. Not the dedicated staff who wanted the best for their charges, but were limited by resources and reality. And especially not the little girl whose fingers now danced across the keys of a piano that had seen better days. In a room that smelled faintly of dust and lost dreams, playing a melody that carried the weight of her short but profound journey through loss and survival. This was only the beginning. The melody from Clara's small fingers filled the dusty music room, growing from hesitant notes into something unexpectedly beautiful. At first, Richard stood with his arms crossed, a half-smile of disbelief frozen on his face. He'd seen this routine before, children putting on performances for wealthy visitors, hoping to charm their way into special treatment or, even more unlikely, adoption. But as Clara continued playing, something shifted in the atmosphere. The simple tune evolved, becoming more complex with each passing moment. Her left hand created a steady rhythm while her right wove a delicate pattern above it. For a child who'd never had formal lessons, it was remarkable. Richard's assistant stopped taking photos, her camera lowering slowly to her side. Mr. Winters, who had been anxiously watching Richard's reaction, now turned his full attention to Clara. Ms. Patel's eyes glistened with quiet pride. Did someone teach you that? Richard asked abruptly, cutting through the music. Clara's fingers stumbled briefly before finding their place again. No, sir. she answered without looking up. I just hear it in my head. Richard frowned. This wasn't part of the script he'd planned for the day. A quick tour, some photos for the foundation website, and then back to his office for an important conference call. He certainly hadn't expected to be challenged by a child barely tall enough to reach the piano pedals. Keep going, he said, his voice betraying a hint of genuine curiosity. Clara nodded and continued, her confidence growing as she sensed the shift in her audience. The melody took on a questioning quality, like a conversation between hope and doubt. Her small shoulders swayed slightly with the rhythm, her face a mask of concentration. She's been here 2 years now, Miss Patel whispered to Richard. Her parents died in an accident. She hardly spoke for months, but she would sit at this piano for hours. Richard gave a non-committal nod, his eyes never leaving Clara's hands. He found himself wondering what formal training might do for this raw talent. Mr. Bennett, Mr. Winters said quietly, your earlier comment about adoption was just a figure of speech. Richard cut in sharply, shooting the director a warning glance. Surely you didn't take it seriously, Mr. Winters flushed. Of course not, I did, came Clara's voice, her fingers still dancing across the keys. I took it seriously. The music continued, but the adults fell silent. Clara played on, pretending not to notice the tension her words had created. Inside, her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her hands remained steady. Richard cleared his throat. Young lady, adults say many things in conversation. Not everything is meant to be taken literally. Clara finally looked up at him, her eyes meeting his directly for the first time. So you were lying? Clara! Ms. Patel gasped. I wasn't lying, Richard responded, his voice cooler now. I was making a casual remark that wasn't meant to be challenged. Clara's hands finally stilled on the keys. The sudden silence felt heavier than the music had been. I understand, she said quietly. You were just pretending to be interested in us. The bluntness of her assessment made Richard's jaw tighten. He wasn't accustomed to being called out, especially not by a child. His assistant shifted uncomfortably beside him, clearly sensing this visit was veering off its carefully planned course. That's not fair, Clara, Mr. Winters interjected nervously. Mr. Bennett has been very generous with his donation. It's all right, Richard held up a hand. She's entitled to her opinion. He studied Clara with new interest, noting the intelligence behind her steady gaze. There was something familiar about her directness that stirred an old memory he couldn't quite place. You play well, he admitted. Who taught you those chord progressions? Nobody, Clara answered. I listen to music on the radio and try to copy the feeling. Then I make up my own parts. Richard nodded slowly. And this piece you're playing, what's it called? Clara hesitated, suddenly self-conscious. I call it After, because it's about life after everything changes. The room grew quiet again. Even Richard, who prided himself on his emotional distance, felt something stir beneath his carefully maintained exterior. Play the rest, he said, surprising everyone, including himself. Clara's eyes widened slightly, but she turned back to the piano without argument. This time, as she began to play, the melody took on a darker tone. The notes in the lower register spoke of loss and confusion, of nights spent staring at unfamiliar ceilings and wondering why the world had tilted on its axis. Richard found himself moving closer to the piano, drawn by something he couldn't name. The other adults remained where they were, sensing that something important was happening between the wealthy man and the orphaned girl. Mr. Bennett, his assistant whispered, we're running late for your next appointment. Richard waved her off without looking away from Clara's hands. Cancel it, he murmured. All of them. Clear the afternoon. The assistant blinked in surprise but stepped away to make the necessary calls. In all her time working for Richard Bennett, she'd never heard him cancel meetings for anything short of a hospital visit. As Clara's composition moved into what was clearly its middle section, the melody began to transform. The sorrow remained, but alongside it grew something else, a tentative resilience, notes that climbed upward like small shoots pushing through soil after a harsh winter. She's telling her story, Ms. Patel whispered to no one in particular. This is how she processes. Richard nodded almost imperceptibly. He recognized what was happening because he'd done the same thing in his youth, though with numbers and code rather than music. Creation as survival, expression as a way through the darkness. It was a language he understood even if he'd forgotten how to speak it over the years. Clara played on, unaware of the effect she was having on the adults around her, especially the wealthy man who had come to their home as a benefactor, but was now standing still as stone, caught in the web of her music. "When did you start composing?" Richard asked when she paused briefly. "After my parents died," Clara answered simply. "The regular songs didn't say the right things, so I had to make new ones." Richard nodded as if this made perfect sense to him, perhaps because it did. "And no one has ever evaluated your musical ability? Given you proper lessons?" He pressed. Mr. Winters stepped forward. "We have limited resources, Mr. Bennett. We do our best with volunteers, but—" "It wasn't a criticism," Richard interrupted, his tone softer than before. "I was merely asking." "A music teacher from the high school comes once a month," Ms. Patel offered. "She says Clara has perfect pitch and exceptional creative instincts. She's been teaching her music notation when she can." Richard turned back to Clara. "Would you like proper lessons? To study with a real teacher?" Clara's expression remained cautious, as if searching for the trick in his question. "Yes," she answered finally. "More than anything. And what would you do with that education? If you could learn properly?" Richard asked, his tone revealing genuine curiosity. Clara thought for a moment. "I'd write music that helps people feel less alone," she said finally. "Music that tells them someone else understands." Richard's expression changed almost imperceptibly, a slight softening around the eyes, a relaxing of the tight line of his mouth. "That's a worthy goal," he said quietly. Then, as if remembering himself, he straightened his posture and adjusted his tie. "But it takes more than talent. It takes discipline, commitment, years of hard work." "I know," Clara said simply, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. "I'm not afraid of hard work." For a brief moment, something like admiration flickered across Richard's face. Then he glanced at his watch and stepped back. "Well, this has been enlightening," he said, his businessman's mask sliding back into place. "Thank you for the performance, young lady." Clara's face fell slightly, but she nodded politely. "Thank you for listening, sir." Richard turned to Mr. Winters. "I'd like to discuss something with you privately before I leave." As the adults stepped out into the hallway, Clara remained at the piano, her fingers hovering over the keys but not pressing down. She had shown this stranger her heart through her music, and now she felt strangely vulnerable, as if she'd given away something precious and wasn't sure if she'd get anything in return. Outside in the corridor, Richard spoke in low tones with the orphanage director, while his assistant made notes on her tablet. Through the partially open door, Clara could see their serious expressions but couldn't hear their words. What she didn't know was that her challenge, both musical and personal, had stirred something long dormant in the wealthy man. As he discussed possibilities with Mr. Winters, Richard Bennett was making calculations and considerations that had never been part of his original plan for this visit. The challenge had been accepted, though neither of them yet understood what that truly meant. 3 days had passed since Richard Bennett's visit to Sunshine Children's Home, and Clara tried to convince herself it meant nothing. She'd been silly to think that a wealthy businessman would care about an orphan's piano playing. Adults made empty promises all the time. She should know that by now. "Clara, someone's here to see you," Ms. Patel called from the doorway of the girl's bedroom where Clara sat reading on her narrow bed. Clara looked up, trying not to hope. "Who is it?" "Come and find out," Ms. Patel said with a smile that made Clara's heart beat faster. Downstairs in the visitor's room sat a woman Clara had never seen before. She was older, perhaps in her 60s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun and wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. She wore a crisp blouse and carried a leather bag that looked worn but expensive. "Clara, this is Mrs. Abernathy," Mr. Winters said, his voice carrying an excitement he was clearly trying to contain. "She's a retired professor from the city conservatory." Clara stood awkwardly in the doorway, unsure what this meant. "Hello," she managed quietly. Mrs. Abernathy's eyes, bright and assessing behind her glasses, studied Clara with interest. "Hello, Clara. I understand you're a musician." Clara shook her head slightly. "I just play sometimes." "I'm not really a musician." Mrs. Abernathy's mouth curved into a gentle smile. "That's not what I've heard. Mr. Bennett was quite insistent that I come evaluate your abilities myself." Clara's eyes widened. "Mr. Bennett? The man who visited on Monday?" "The very same," Mrs. Abernathy nodded. "He's a..." An old friend of my late husband's, and when Richard Bennett asks for a favor, it's usually something important. Clara looked to Miss Patel, who nodded encouragingly. Mrs. Abernathy is here to listen to you play, dear. Isn't that wonderful? Wonderful wasn't exactly the word Clara would have chosen. Terrifying came closer. Playing for the children and staff was one thing. They were family. Playing for Mr. Bennett had been an impulse born of indignation. But playing for a real music professor? Her palms grew damp at the thought. I'm not very good, she whispered. Why don't we find out together? Mrs. Abernathy suggested, rising from her chair. Is there a piano we can use? 20 minutes later, Clara sat rigidly on the piano bench in the music room with Mrs. Abernathy beside her. The professor had spent several minutes checking Clara's posture, gently correcting the placement of her hands, and asking simple questions about what music she enjoyed. Now, Mrs. Abernathy said, I understand you composed something yourself. Would you play that for me first? Clara nodded, took a deep breath, and began the piece she had played for Richard Bennett. It felt different this time, more deliberate, as she was acutely aware of being evaluated. The first few notes came out stiff and mechanical. Stop, Mrs. Abernathy said gently. Close your eyes for a moment. Clara obeyed, her hands frozen above the keys. Now forget I'm here. Forget this is a test. Remember why you wrote this music in the first place. Who were you playing for when you created it? Clara thought about this. For my parents, she whispered, and for myself. Then play for them now, Mrs. Abernathy suggested. I'm just lucky enough to overhear it. Clara kept her eyes closed, picturing her mother's gentle smile, her father's hearty laugh. She began again, and this time the music flowed naturally, carrying with it all the emotion she'd poured into its creation. Mrs. Abernathy remained silent, letting Clara play the piece from beginning to end without interruption. When the final notes faded, Clara opened her eyes, surprised to find them damp with tears. That was remarkable, Mrs. Abernathy said quietly. Especially for someone with no formal training. You have a gift for emotional expression that can't be taught. Clara looked down at her hands. Thank you, she murmured. For the next hour, Mrs. Abernathy ran Clara through various exercises, testing her ability to repeat melodies by ear, to recognize different chord structures, to sight-read simple notation. Through it all, the professor made notes in a small leather-bound book, her expression giving away nothing. Well, she said finally, closing her notebook, I believe I have what I need. Clara's stomach tightened. Did I do okay? Mrs. Abernathy studied her for a moment. Clara, you did far better than okay. You have extraordinary natural talent. With proper training, you could become quite accomplished. Clara hardly dared believe what she was hearing. Really? Really, the professor confirmed with a warm smile. Now let's go speak with your director. I have some recommendations to make. Back in Mr. Winter's office, Mrs. Abernathy spoke in professional tones while Clara waited outside with Ms. Patel. The minutes stretched endlessly until finally the door opened, and Mr. Winters called them in, his face alight with barely contained excitement. Clara, he said, Mrs. Abernathy has something to tell you. The professor turned to Clara with a smile. I've informed Mr. Winters that you have exceptional aptitude. I've recommended you for a special scholarship program at the preparatory division of the conservatory. It would mean weekly private lessons, theory classes, and participation in student recitals. Clara's mouth fell open. A scholarship for me? Yes, for you, Mrs. Abernathy nodded. The Bennett Foundation has agreed to cover all expenses, including transportation to and from lessons. Clara could hardly process what she was hearing. The Bennett Foundation? You mean Mr. Bennett is paying for this? He's made a special provision for talented young musicians from disadvantaged backgrounds, Mrs. Abernathy explained. Though I must say he seemed particularly interested in your case. Before Clara could respond, the office phone rang. Mr. Winters answered it, listened for a moment, then looked up with surprise. Speaking of Mr. Bennett, he said, covering the mouthpiece, he's on the line now, asking to speak with Clara. The room fell silent. Mrs. Abernathy raised an eyebrow but nodded as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. Put it on speaker, Ms. Patel suggested. We should all hear this. Mr. Winters pressed a button and suddenly Richard Bennett's confident voice filled the small office. Is Clara there? He asked without preamble. I'm here, Clara answered, her voice small but steady. Ah, good, Richard said. I trust you've met with Professor Abernathy by now? Yes, sir. Thank you for sending her. She says I can get lessons at the conservatory. That's right, Richard confirmed. But there's something else we need to discuss. Do you remember our conversation on Monday? Clara's heart skipped a beat. You said if you heard a child play something truly impressive, you might consider funding music lessons. I also said something else, Richard prompted. Something about adoption. The adults in the room exchanged glances. Clara stood very still, afraid to breathe too deeply for fear of shattering whatever fragile moment was unfolding. You said you might even adopt a musical prodigy, she recalled carefully. But later you said it was just a figure of speech. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Richard spoke again, his tone had changed, becoming more measured, more serious. I've been doing some thinking since our meeting, he said. Your performance affected me. It reminded me of things I'd forgotten. Clara waited, sensing there was more. I'm not in a position to offer adoption, Richard continued, making Clara's heart sink despite her best efforts not to hope. My lifestyle, my work commitments, it wouldn't be fair to any child. I understand, Clara said quietly, working hard to keep disappointment from her voice. However, Richard went on, I am proposing something else. A guardianship arrangement. Mr. Winters leaned forward. Mr. Bennett, what exactly are you suggesting? I'd like to establish a legal relationship as Clara's educational guardian, Richard explained. It would allow me to make decisions regarding her musical training and academic future, provide financial support, and take her to important performances and opportunities that might arise. She would continue living at Sunshine Home for now, with regular visits to my home for additional lessons and cultural experiences. The adults looked at each other, clearly stunned by this unexpected proposal. It's an unusual arrangement, Richard acknowledged into the silence, but I believe it could benefit Clara tremendously. And perhaps, he paused, his voice softening slightly, perhaps it might benefit me as well. Clara found her voice. Why me? She asked simply. There are other kids here who play instruments. Another pause. Your music spoke to me, Richard answered finally. It made me remember what it felt like to create something from nothing, to express things words can't capture. I haven't felt that way in a very long time. Clara absorbed this, understanding somehow that this wealthy, powerful man had revealed something important, something he probably didn't share often. Would I get to keep playing my own music? She asked. Not just the classical pieces everyone learns. Especially your own music, Richard assured her. That's what makes you special, Clara. The world has plenty of technically proficient pianists. What it needs are genuine voices, people who have something unique to say. Clara looked at Ms. Patel, who gave her an encouraging nod, tears shimmering in her eyes. I'd like that, Clara said finally. I'd like that very much, Mr. Bennett. Good, Richard replied, and for the first time since they'd met, Clara thought she could hear a smile in his voice. Then let's begin. None of them could have known in that moment how this unusual arrangement would change all their lives, least of all Richard Bennett, who had come to Sunshine Children's Home for a simple photo opportunity and found instead the beginning of his own unexpected second movement. 2 months into their unusual arrangement, Clara sat in the passenger seat of Richard's sleek silver car, watching the city landscape blur past the window. Every Saturday followed the same routine. Richard's driver would pick her up from Sunshine Home in the morning, bring her to the conservatory for her lessons with Mrs. Abernathy, and then take her to Richard's penthouse for lunch and an afternoon of additional practice on his grand piano. How was your lesson today? Richard asked, scrolling through emails on his phone. Although he always sent his driver for the morning pickup, he made a point of collecting Clara himself after her lessons. Good, Clara replied, her fingers tapping an invisible keyboard on her knee. Mrs. Abernathy says my technique is improving. Richard glanced up from his phone, sensing something in her tone. But, Clara shrugged, still looking out the window. She wants me to focus more on the classical pieces and less on my own compositions. Richard put his phone away, giving her his full attention, something Clara had noticed he rarely did with anyone else. And you don't agree? I like learning the classical pieces, Clara said carefully. But the songs in my head, they keep coming, and if I don't play them, it feels like... She struggled to find the right words. Like they're trapped inside you, Richard finished for her. Like they need to get out. Clara nodded, relieved that he understood. Exactly. Richard was quiet for a moment, considering. Let me talk to Elizabeth, Mrs. Abernathy. A good education includes mastering the fundamentals, but your original compositions are what make you special. We need to nurture both. Clara turned to look at him, still sometimes surprised by how much he seemed to care about her development. Thank you. The car pulled into the underground garage of Richard's building. As they rode the elevator to the penthouse, Clara went through her mental checklist of questions she wanted to ask him. Their Saturday afternoons had fallen into a pattern. Lunch prepared by his housekeeper, 2 hours of practice on his magnificent Steinway grand piano, and then an hour of what Richard called cultural enrichment, usually listening to recordings of famous pianists or watching performances he'd selected. Today, though Clara had a different request in mind, Richard's penthouse never failed to impress her with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Minimalist furniture that probably cost more than everything in Sunshine Home combined. And the centerpiece, a gleaming black Steinway in a room designed specifically for its perfect acoustics. Mrs. Liu left us chicken salad and fresh bread, Richard said, heading to the kitchen. Are you hungry? Clara nodded, following him. She waited until they were seated at the island counter before working up her courage. I was wondering something. Richard raised an eyebrow, spreading a napkin across his lap. Yes? Could you tell me about when you were my age? Did you play music too? The question clearly caught him off guard. Richard's fork paused halfway to his mouth, then slowly lowered back to his plate. In the 2 months of their arrangement, he had asked countless questions about her life, her thoughts on music, her experiences at the orphanage, but he rarely volunteered information about himself. What makes you ask that? He said finally. Clara picked at her salad. You understand things. About creating music, about why it matters, but you never talk about yourself. Richard took a sip of water, his expression thoughtful. For a moment, Clara thought he might change the subject, as he often did when conversations became too personal. I didn't play piano, he said finally. I played violin. Clara's eyes widened. Really? Are you good? A faint smile touched his lips. I haven't played in... He paused, calculating. Almost 20 years now. Why did you stop? Richard's gaze drifted to the windows, to the city skyline beyond. Life got complicated. Business became my focus. There wasn't time for music anymore. Clara frowned, unable to imagine choosing to give up music for anything. But didn't you miss it? You don't always realize what you're missing until something reminds you, Richard said quietly, his eyes finding hers. Like a young girl playing her heart out on an old piano. Heat rose to Clara's cheeks and she looked down at her plate. I still have my violin, Richard continued, surprising her. Somewhere in storage. I haven't thought about it in years. Could you play something for me sometime? Clara asked, hoping she wasn't pushing too far. Richard's expression clouded. I doubt I remember how. And I have a company to run. Clara nodded, recognizing his tone as the one he used when closing a subject. They ate in silence for a few minutes before Richard spoke again. Tell me what you're working on this week. The Chopin or your new piece? Clara accepted the change of topic. Both. But there's something I wanted to ask you about my new composition. Richard's interest visibly sparked. What's that? It's getting more complicated than I can write down with the basic notation I know. Mrs. Abernathy helps, but I was wondering. She hesitated, then pushed forward. Could I record it here? On your piano? It sounds so much better than the one at Sunshine. Of course, Richard nodded. We can set up professional recording equipment. Actually, he stopped, seeming to consider something. Actually, I have a better idea. After lunch, instead of their usual practice session, Richard led Clara to a part of his penthouse she'd never seen before, a home office with 3 large monitors and equipment. She didn't recognize. This is where I test new software. Sometimes, he explained, pulling out a chair for her. But it's also got something that might interest you. He tapped a few keys on his keyboard, and one of the screens filled with what looked like a musical staff. This is composition software. Professional composers use it to write and arrange music. It can capture what you play and convert it to notation automatically. Clara leaned forward, fascinated. It can write down what I play? Just like that? Just like that, Richard confirmed. It can also let you hear how different instruments would sound playing your music. Strings, woodwinds, even a full orchestra. Can I try it? Clara asked, barely containing her excitement. Richard nodded, already setting up a MIDI keyboard connected to the computer. Let's get you started with the basics today. For the next 2 hours, Richard patiently showed Clara how to use the software, his usual reserve melting away as he explained features and answered her increasingly complex questions. Clara soaked up the information like a sponge, quickly grasping concepts that Richard mentioned had taken him weeks to master. "You're a natural at this," he commented, as she successfully layered a string section beneath her piano melody. "You think structurally, which most young composers struggle with." Clara beamed at the praise. "This is amazing. Could I use this every Saturday?" "I think we could arrange that," Richard said, checking his watch. "In fact," he paused, seeming to make a decision, "I've been thinking. These few hours once a week aren't enough for your development." Clara's smile faded slightly. "Oh, I understand if you're busy. You've already done so much." "That's not what I meant," Richard interrupted. "I meant it's not enough time for your talent. You need more access to proper equipment, better instruction, daily practice on a good instrument." "But that's not possible at Sunshine," Clara said, stating the obvious. "No," Richard agreed, "which is why I've been considering another option." Clara waited, suddenly nervous. "I've been talking with Mr. Winters and my lawyers," Richard continued, his tone carefully measured, "about the possibility of you staying here part of the week. Perhaps Sunday through Wednesday, then back to Sunshine for the remainder." Clara's heart began to race. "You mean live here with you?" "It wouldn't be a full adoption," Richard clarified quickly. "More an extension of our current guardianship arrangement. You'd have your own room here, access to the piano whenever you wanted, daily lessons with tutors I'd bring in, and I could take you to concerts, rehearsals, introduce you to working musicians. But why would you do all that for me?" Clara asked, genuinely confused. People didn't just offer homes and opportunities to orphans without wanting something in return. Life had taught her that much. Richard studied her for a long moment. "Because talent like yours comes along rarely. Because you deserve every chance to develop it fully. And because—" He hesitated, then continued more softly. "Because in some ways you remind me of myself at your age." Before things got complicated, Clara didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to jump at the chance, a real home, a real piano, real opportunities. But another part, the cautious part that had protected her through years of disappointment, held back. "What if it doesn't work out?" she asked finally. "What if you get tired of having a kid around?" Richard's expression softened in a way she'd rarely seen. "That's a fair question. How about this, we try it for 1 month. If either of us feels it isn't working, you return to your full-time placement at Sunshine, no hard feelings, and we continue our Saturday arrangement. And if it does work, then we make it permanent, or as permanent as you want it to be." Clara took a deep breath, weighing the biggest decision of her young life. "Could I still see my friends at Sunshine? And Ms. Patel?" "Of course," Richard assured her. "This isn't about taking you away from what you know. It's about adding possibilities." Clara nodded slowly. I think I'd like to try." A rare, genuine smile spread across Richard's face. "Good. I'll make the arrangements." Neither of them could have predicted how those arrangements would be tested in the weeks to come, or how a simple piano recital would force both of them to confront the walls they'd built around their hearts. The grand ballroom of the Westfield Hotel buzzed with anticipation. Tonight marked the spring recital for students of the City Conservatory, and the room was filled with proud parents, distinguished music lovers, and a few talent scouts from prestigious academies. Programs rustled as attendees flipped through pages to read about the young performers. Backstage, Clara peeked through the curtain at the growing crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs. 3 months had passed since she'd begun splitting her time between Sunshine Home and Richard's penthouse. 3 months of intensive training, late nights composing at Richard's Steinway, and gradually learning to trust that this new life might actually last. "Nervous," came Richard's voice from behind her. Clara turned to find him holding a small bouquet of white roses. He looked different tonight, more approachable somehow in his dark suit with his usually perfect hair slightly tousled from the spring breeze outside. "Terrified," she admitted, accepting the flowers. "What if I mess up? What if they hate my composition?" Richard adjusted his tie, a gesture Clara had come to recognize as his way of collecting his thoughts. "Do you remember what you told me about why you write music?" Clara nodded. "To help people feel less alone. To show them someone understands. Then play for that person tonight," Richard said simply. "The one who needs to hear exactly what you have to say. Forget everyone else." Clara took a deep breath. "Even you?" A shadow of something, hurt, surprise, crossed Richard's face. "Especially me," he said after a moment. "This isn't about me, Clara, it's about your voice." Before she could respond, Mrs. Abernathy appeared, elegant in a long blue dress. "Clara, you're on in 10 minutes. Time to warm up your hands." Clara nodded and handed the flowers back to Richard. "Will you put these in water for me?" "Of course," he said, stepping back. "I'll be in the front row. Not that you should notice me," he added with a rare smile. As Clara followed Mrs. Abernathy to the practice room, she thought about how much had changed. The part-time living arrangement had been awkward at first. Richard clearly unused to having a child in his space. Clara uncertain of her place in his carefully ordered world. There had been tense moments, misunderstandings, and one memorable argument about practicing too late at night that had ended with Richard installing soundproofing in the music room. But there had also been unexpected joys. Richard taking her to see the City Symphony, late-night hot chocolate while discussing musical theory, and the gradual softening of his businessman persona into something more human, more vulnerable. "Focus, Clara," Mrs. Abernathy instructed, bringing her back to the present. "Run through the difficult passage once more." Clara obeyed, her fingers dancing across the keys of the practice piano. Tonight she would play 2 pieces, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, which showcased her technical progress, and her own composition, which Mrs. Abernathy had helped her title, Unexpected Family. The composition had started as Clara's way of processing her complicated feelings about her new life with Richard. It began with a solitary melody representing her life at the orphanage, beautiful but lonely. Then came a second theme, rigid and structured, representing Richard's ordered existence. Throughout the piece, these melodies intertwined, sometimes clashing, sometimes harmonizing, until they finally merged into something new and unexpected. "It's time," Mrs. Abernathy said, checking her watch. "Remember, steady tempo, expressive dynamics, and trust your preparation." Clara nodded and followed her teacher toward the stage. As she waited in the wings, watching another student finish his performance, she spotted a familiar face in the audience that made her heart leap. Ms. Patel sat 3 rows back, surrounded by a small group of children from Sunshine Home. They had come to support her. Next to them sat Richard's assistant, who had gradually warmed to Clara over the months, and even Mr. Winters had made an appearance. But it was Richard who caught and held her attention. He sat perfectly still in the center of the front row, his expression unreadable from this distance. For someone who had done so much to make this night possible, he looked strangely alone. The audience applauded as the current performer bowed and left the stage. Mrs. Abernathy squeezed Clara's shoulder gently. "You're ready." Clara walked onto the stage, the polished floor reflecting the spotlight that followed her to the magnificent concert grand. She adjusted the bench, placed her hands in her lap, and took a deep breath. The Chopin came first. Her fingers found the keys with practiced precision, muscle memory taking over as she lost herself in the familiar melody. She had played this piece 100 times in practice, but tonight it felt different, more alive somehow. When the final notes faded, the applause was warm and appreciative. Clara stood and bowed as she had been taught, then returned to the piano for her original composition. This was the piece that truly mattered to her, the one that held her heart. As she positioned her hands, she glanced briefly at Richard. To her surprise, he looked tense, almost uncomfortable, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. She began to play, and the world around her disappeared. The melody poured from her fingers, the solitary theme of her life before, the structured counterpoint of Richard's existence, the tentative moments of connection, the minor key conflicts, and finally, the resolution into something neither could have created alone. Clara was so absorbed in the music that she didn't notice the complete silence that had fallen over the ballroom, or the way Richard had leaned forward in his seat, or the tears gathering in Ms. Patel's eyes. She played the final chord and let it ring, only then becoming aware of the stillness she had created. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the applause began, scattered at first, then building into a wave that crashed over her. Clara stood and bowed, her cheeks flushing with the unexpected intensity of the response. As she looked up, she saw Richard standing, his face transformed by an expression she'd never seen before. Pride, yes, but something else too. Something raw and unguarded that made him look younger somehow. Later, after the other performances had concluded and the reception was in full swing, Clara found herself surrounded by well-wishers. Mrs. Abernathy introduced her to music directors and potential mentors, while the children from Sunshine bombarded her with excited questions. Through it all, she kept looking for Richard, but he seemed to have disappeared. Just as she was beginning to worry, Ms. Patel touched her arm and pointed toward a quiet corner of the ballroom. There stood Richard, deep in conversation with an older man carrying a violin case. Their body language suggested intensity, disagreement perhaps. As Clara watched, the older man opened the case and thrust the violin toward Richard, who shook his head firmly. "Who's that?" Clara asked Ms. Patel. "I don't know, dear. Mr. Bennett stepped out right after your performance. When he came back, he was with that gentleman." Curious, Clara excused herself and made her way across the room. As she approached, she heard the older man saying, "After 20 years, Richard." "Isn't it time?" Richard noticed her then and fell silent. "Clara," he said, his voice strangely rough. "Congratulations. Your performance was exceptional." "Thank you," she said. "Who's your friend?" The older man smiled warmly. "Thomas Rivera, former concert violinist and Richard's old teacher. Though he seems to have forgotten everything I taught him about courage." Richard shot Thomas an irritated look. "Clara, would you excuse us for a moment?" "Actually," Thomas interjected, "I think she should stay. After all, she inspired this whole conversation." Clara looked between them, confused. "What do you mean?" Thomas held out the violin to Richard once more. "Your guardian here was once a promising young violinist, one of the most talented I ever taught, until he decided that business was a more practical path. And it was," Richard said firmly. "Still is." "Then why did you call me after all these years?" Thomas challenged. "Why ask me to bring your old violin tonight?" Clara's eyes widened as she understood. "You were going to play?" Richard's expression softened as he looked at her. "Your composition, the way it described our journey. He thought perhaps he could finally stop hiding behind his wealth and remember what music really means." Thomas finished for him. "But now he's lost his nerve." Clara considered this for a moment, then held out her hand for the violin. Thomas passed it to her with a curious expression. "You played for me tonight," she said, offering the instrument to Richard. "Maybe it's time I heard you play too." Richard stared at the violin, conflicting emotions crossing his face. "I haven't played in 20 years. I'll embarrass myself, so?" Clara shrugged. "I embarrass myself all the time. You still let me stay?" A startled laugh escaped Richard. "That's different." "Not really," Clara insisted. "You always tell me that music is about honesty, not perfection. Were you lying?" The challenge hung in the air between them. Around the room, people continued their conversations, unaware of the small drama unfolding in the corner. Finally, Richard reached for the violin with hands that trembled slightly. "One piece," he said quietly, "and a simple one at that." Thomas smiled knowingly and stepped back. Clara watched as Richard positioned the instrument under his chin, closed his eyes for a moment, and drew the bow across the strings. The first notes were hesitant, a bit scratchy. But then, like a voice remembering how to speak after a long silence, the melody emerged, simple but heartfelt. Clara recognized Bach's Air on the G string, a piece of such pure emotion that even played imperfectly. It touched something deep within the listener. A small crowd gathered, drawn by the unexpected performance. Clara watched Richard's face as he played, seeing layers of armor fall away with each measure. By the time he finished, he looked both exhausted and somehow lighter, as if he'd set down a heavy burden he'd carried for too long. The applause was gentle, respectful. Richard bowed awkwardly, then handed the violin back to Thomas with a nod of thanks. As the crowd dispersed, Richard turned to Clara. "Well, what did you think?" Clara considered her answer carefully. "I think," she said finally, "that we both have a lot to teach each other." Richard's smile then, unguarded, genuine, was worth more than all his millions. "I believe you're right," he said, offering her his hand. "Partners?" Clara took it without hesitation. Partners. And in that moment, something shifted between them. The final transformation of their arrangement into something neither had expected, but both now recognized. A family, built note by note, composed through both harmony and discord, but stronger for having found each other.